Welcome to Lecture 10. This is our final lecture, and we will be talking about creating soundscapes and the implementation behind that, and also the more abstract, bigger picture. So, at the very beginning of the course, I talked about the role of the audio director. And this is the person who's really accountable for everything, not just the music, sound, and dialogue in the game, but also its implementation. It also entails being responsible for various games within your company or within your organization. It may also include any audio for the company's website or social media, any sort of marketing or trade shows that need audio, or any sort of internal development like tools that may need some audio or some sound effects, for example. And as you can imagine, it is a huge undertaking. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that the audio director can be a very creative and exciting job, but it also is an administrative job because you're managing potentially many other people. And so you'll spend a lot of your day, just entering tasks and almost being like a producer of sorts. But it is a really challenging and exciting opportunity should you decide to take on this role in your career. So what do I need for each category? I'm working on some kind of generic game here. What will the categories require for music and sound and dialogue? And really the answer is thousands of things potentially. If we have any sort of game that involves more than a few hours of play, it may entail maybe 2 hours of music. Who knows? There could be thousands of sound effects, and there could be tens of thousands of lines of dialogue, and especially if you include, as I've mentioned before, any localization where you have multiple languages, you will be working with lots and lots of assets. Which brings me to the next point, which is now we have all this material. What do we do with it? And it's one thing to say, yeah, it's going to go into the game and everything's going to be great, which is a terrible way to plan these days. Maybe that worked 20 years ago where you didn't have so many assets and so much material to deal with, and you could just manually just kind of hard code this stuff into a game. But nowadays, we really have to have more care with the material that we have. And so there are aesthetic considerations in terms of the style of the content that we have. Does it all match the sonic palette that we're looking for? And the technical considerations, not just the file formats and has this been recorded and produced and edited correctly and mastered correctly, but what is the technical implementation of this? And does it really match our goal of trying to create this soundscape that's going to suspend our disbelief, right? So let's take a look at all those thousands of things just for a moment. And this is, well, I've got dozens of things maybe on this slide, but there are thousands of things, trust me. If you have aesthetic considerations for music, sound, dialogue, what would those be? Just really quick here, I'll just tap into a couple of these. So is your music going to be upbeat? Does it need to be kind of, sedate or serene? Is it going to be in the background or in your face? Do you have music segments? Are you going to be doing interactive or adaptive music? Are you going to have some sort of sweeping epic soundtrack that doesn't require any sort of segmentation? It's more of a jukebox mode, right? For sound effects, maybe I don't want to have a cacophony of noise. I want to have something that perhaps is serene, maybe, or maybe it's a little bit dynamic. It changes with time of day and seasons. For my dialogue, maybe I have a wide variety of characters, men, women, children. Maybe it's some sort of, ancient city builder, the types of games I used to work on back in the day. And you have characters that have accents. Maybe it's ancient Rome, and we've come to believe that everyone had British accents in ancient Rome, which couldn't be further from the truth, but we're used to that from the Shakespearean acting companies that would put on these plays, Shakespeare plays or something based in Rome or what have you. And then for technical considerations, we have all kinds of things. Let's just take a look at music for a second. What are the file sizes, the total times of, perhaps we have segments. Do we have it beat based? Maybe we have tempo mapping involved. We need to know exactly how long something's going to play per second, per minute. And do we have a bunch of different music modes, like the win-lose type of tunes that need to play. Perhaps there's setup music. Perhaps there's some ambient underscores that we need to have coupled with battle music. So we have this kind of horizontal sequencing and vertical orchestration that we discussed in the previous lecture. Sound really can have a number of layers. You can get quite complex with the implementation of sound as well. And maybe you have a screen where you're looking at this city builder and you're kind of scrolling by, and at any one moment there are some buildings on the screen. Perhaps they're active and they're generating, they have animations that tell the player, "Hey, I'm generating material here," and so you have a sound effect that may play for that, and it may be sampled randomly, kind of the roll of a dice for one to play at any given time. And that doesn't just happen magically. We have to either hard code that or get that into in part to an audio engine some capacity. And for dialogue, we could have, again, thousands of files, right? And we may want to also have dialogue that's based on some sort of speech engine. Maybe there's a conversation engine that you could have between characters that could be adaptive just for the sake of flavor, or it could be interactive that has some clues that provides feedback as far as the progress in the game, clues that you may need to move forward in the game. All right. So there's all kinds of things that can happen aesthetically and technically in your game, and who knows what they are. Only you will know what they are. But we have to consider, regardless of what it is, we have to balance the aesthetic with the technical perfectly to have this nice choreography play out that we envisioned as our soundscape. All right. So how do we get that just right? And here's just a little snapshot from a game I worked on many years ago, Children of the Nile. All right. And we saw the case study I gave you with the cutscene production from the game, and I've referred to it in a bunch of different lectures. And just have here, watch out for flying chips. This is a work site. That's a stone cutter. And as that happens, there's somebody walking by, and the person says, "I honestly think my commute gets a little worse each year." To me, all kinds of funny things that the characters would say, but it would help you say, okay, my stone cutter building is working, and people having conversations, and there's music playing and sound effects, and we want to get that balance just right in the game. And that really comes down to mixing issues. You'll want to work with, you may be this person, you may be the composer, sound designer, and dialogue lead, right? The chief cook and bottle washer, as they used to call it. You're doing everything. And so you need to make sure, whether it's you or a bunch of people, to all be communicating with each other, all right? And establish how the content's going to work in the game. Not what the content is necessarily, but just how it's going to work in the game. So you want to construct a soundscape in layers. And you want to make sure that the volumes and EQ and the effects for all these files in the mix work well together. As I've mentioned before, sometimes we don't bake or render files with a lot of reverb in them, for example. We could, and it's perfectly fine to do that. But there may be situations where you don't want to have a lot of files, for example, have reverb in them, but maybe you want to play it live in the mix. Like if you're running it on Unity or Unreal or something like that, you can actually play that sort of effect in real time and just kind of blanket it over a certain category of sounds rather than have 90 sounds with reverb playing at the same time. That sort of thing. Any kind of problem could come up, but we want to make sure that the effects, EQ, volume all work well in the total mix. Okay. Not an easy task. It's a very iterative one. And when we add that final polish, we're going through our mastering phase. We want to make sure that all of our levels, volume-wise, are consistent. And one trick that I do sometimes is I make little holes in the EQs that are needed in the different categories of sound. So an example I give here is that I may notch out, using a notch filter, certain bass frequencies in the music files, so that if there's a game that has like explosions, those may be able to be heard clearer in the game. Another technique may be not to do that, but to bring everything down a little bit and let those explosions seem larger than life, but you're bringing everything else down in a very subtle way. That's called ducking, as we learned early in the course. So those are just a couple of techniques you could do as part of the mastering process. The ducking is more of an implementation driven event. but certainly, the EQ little notches we make and accentuations here and there and other categories is a technique that is used quite often. The one thing you want to do before you do any of this is to make sure that everything you have is in your sound asset list. When you're done, you can start, you can be checking it off as you go, and you may have certain columns, as I've shown you in the past, for making sure that the sounds exist, that they have been put into version control software of some kind, whether you're using SVN or GitHub or Perforce, Sourcesafe, you name it. And then, has it been tested? That's another great category to have in your sound asset list. So someone listen to this thing. Is it actually playing in the game in the right conditions? And so that's a little call you might want to have. And all sorts of material that you'll have in the list that you'll need to refer to on a regular basis. But at the end, you want to make sure everything has been completed and you're ready to go. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is in terms of controlling all these different layers of sound, right? You have your music, your sound, your dialogue, everything's cooking along, but you may run into an instance where you're in maybe it's a space shooter game or something like that, and you're flying your ship like a side scroller, and all these aliens are coming towards you and other enemy ships, and you start firing your lasers, and they're all firing theirs, and before you know it, there's like 300 ships on the screen all firing their lasers. Do you let all those fire at once? That's going to bring your volume level way up, and it's also going to turn into a cacophony of noise. If you allowed the game to play every single sound in every instance when it was supposed to play, I think things would come to a halt, not necessarily processor-wise, but to your soundscape, it would just be effectively ruined, okay? Because you have a cacophony of noise at this point, and the listener doesn't want to hear this barrage. I mean, if it's for a brief moment or two, and it helps convey the message of total chaos, then okay, that's fine. But you don't want to get in the habit of letting your audio just run rampant. You want to have a harness on this, keep things under control. For example, you may only need so many people on your screen making sounds, right? It could be any sort of active buildings, if we're referring to the city builder here, any sort of special events, animals, terrain that has, like maybe there's wind blowing through trees, or there's water in a babbling brook that needs to be heard. At time of day, there may be different animals you hear, and weather. All right. If you let all this stuff happen unchecked, sounds could go on and on and on, and you end up with a cacophony of noise. So you want to set some limits, set some kind of a ceiling or a priority for all the sounds, different priority levels, and attain sort of balance, what I call the happy medium, right? So we'll just hold that thought for a minute.